Admiral Minji felt the metal floor shake beneath her feet as another explosion hit her ship. The bridge around her was filled with smoke and the smell of burning circuits. Red warning lights flashed everywhere, casting strange shadows on the walls. Through the main screen, she could see the enemy ships getting closer. They looked like giant red sharks swimming through space. And there were so many of them. The hegemony had been attacking for 3 months now. Every week brought news of another colony destroyed, another planet burned to nothing. Minji had watched her own fleet get smaller and smaller as ships were destroyed or badly damaged. Now she was down to just 12 vessels, and half of those were barely holding together. "Admiral, we're losing power to the weapons systems," called out Lieutenant Suyang from across the bridge. The young officer's uniform was torn and dirty, and there was a cut on her forehead from when a console had exploded earlier. Minji nodded, but kept her focus on the communication. It's a panel in front of her. I had been thinking about this moment for weeks, ever since the reports started coming in about Earth. The humans had been locked away in their solar system for over 50 years. The Galactic Council had put up barriers around their space and told everyone to stay away. They said humans were too dangerous, too violent, too unpredictable. But Minji remembered the old stories. Before the quarantine, humans had fought alongside other species that had a reputation for never giving up, for fighting even when everything seemed hopeless. Some aliens called them crazy, others called them heroes. Right now, Minji was hoping they were both. "Open all emergency frequencies," she ordered, her voice cutting through the noise of the damaged bridge. "Include the restricted channels." Of them, Communications Officer Hyen looked up from his station with wide eyes. His hands stopped moving over the controls. "Admiral, you know what you're asking? The Council has strict rules about contacting Sol System. If they find out we sent a message to the humans, they could remove you from command. They could even put you in prison." Minji looked around at her burning bridge, at her injured crew, at the enemy ships filling the screen. She thought about the millions of families on the colonies behind them, waiting to be saved. She thought about the children in the schools and the hospitals, all counting on her to protect them. "Look around you, Hyen," she said quietly. "The Council isn't here. Half their member worlds are already ash. Their rules don't matter anymore when our people are dying." She turned back to the communication panel and began typing the message herself. Her clawed fingers moved quickly across the strange symbols of the human language they had learned years ago. The message was simple but desperate. "To any human forces in Sol System, this is Admiral Mingi of the Zephyrian Defense Fleet. We are under attack by the hegemony. Our defenses have failed. Our colonies are burning. We have nowhere else to turn. If you can hear this message, we need your help. Our children are dying. Please respond." She attached the coordinates of their most important battles. The locations where civilians were trapped, the places where a few ships might make the difference between life and death, and then she pressed the transmission button. The message shot out into space faster than light, racing toward the distant yellow star where the humans lived. As it traveled through the darkness, Minji wondered what she had just done. Had she called for salvation, or had she just invited something even more dangerous than the hegemony into their war? Another explosion shook the ship, and she pushed those thoughts away. Right now, any help was better than no help at all, Admiral. Jiho walked slowly around the massive holographic table in the center of the underground command room. The image floating above it showed star systems scattered across space, each one marked with different colored lights.
Elements.
Red lights meant danger. Yellow meant unknown. Blue meant safe. Right now, there were far too many red lights. The room was carved deep into the mountains outside Sol, built during the early days when humans first learned they weren't alone in the universe. Thick concrete walls surrounded them. In the air, recycling systems hummed quietly in the background. This was where Earth's military leaders came when the situation was truly serious. 3 hours ago, a message had arrived from somewhere far across the galaxy. It wasn't the usual diplomatic communication that came through official channels. This was raw, desperate, sent on emergency frequencies that were supposed to be used only when entire civilizations were about to die. Play the message again, Jiho said to the technician operating the communications equipment. The alien voice filled the room, translated into Korean by the computer systems. Admiral Minji was asking for help from people she had never met. From a species that had been locked away from the rest of the galaxy for 50 years, Captain Soman stood at attention near the wall, her hands clasped behind her back. She was young. For a captain, only 35, but she had grown up hearing stories about the hegemony. Every human military officer knew about them, even though they had never fought them directly. "Tell me what we know about this hegemony," Jiho said, still looking at the holographic display. Soman stepped forward and pointed to several star systems on the map. They're a military empire that started expanding about 20 years ago. Don't negotiate or make treaties. They just attack, conquer, and take whatever they want. When they conquered the Centauri colonies 12 years ago, they killed anyone who couldn't work and turned the rest into slaves. Jiho remembered watching the news reports from that war. Pictures of burned cities, refugee ships fleeing into space, families torn apart. The Galactic Council had held meetings and made speeches, but they never sent any help. They said it wasn't their problem, that interfering would just make things worse. "How many people died in that war?" he asked quietly. "Over 50 million. Salman replied. "And that was just one star system. Intelligence reports say they've conquered at least 8 systems since then. Each time it's the same pattern. They destroy the military, enslave the population, and strip the planets of resources." Giho nodded and touched a control on the holographic table. New images appeared, showing the current situation in Zephyrian space. Dozens of colonies were under attack. Millions of civilians were trapped on planets with no way to escape.
Air.
Military was fighting bravely, but they were heavily outnumbered. "Sir," said Lieutenant Min Jae from his position at the communications console, "we're receiving reports from our deep space monitoring stations. They're detecting massive hegemony fleet movements. This isn't just an attack on the Zephyrians. This looks like the beginning of a major expansion campaign." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this information. If the hegemony was planning to expand their territory significantly, it would mean millions more deaths. Eventually, they might even threaten Earth itself. Jiho walked over to a secure communication terminal and placed his hand on the identity scanner. The screen lit up, showing him connected to every major military base and shipyard in the solar system. "This is Admiral Jiho to all fleet commanders," he said in a calm, steady voice. "We have received a distress call from the Zephyrian coalition. They're under attack by the hegemony. After 50 years of isolation, it's time for humanity to rejoin the galaxy. Operation Thunderbolt is now authorized. All available ships are to be prepared for immediate departure. We launch in 6 hours. Across the solar system, alarms began sounding in shipyards and military bases. Ships that had been mothballed for decades were suddenly surrounded by crews of engineers and technicians, bringing them back to life. Pilots who had been training in simulators for years were finally getting their chance to fly real missions. The humans were going back to war. Commander Seojin gripped the armrest of his captain's chair as the stars suddenly stopped, streaking past his ship's windows. The hyperspace jump was complete, and they had arrived at New Haven system. What he saw through the main viewport made his jaw clench with anger. The planet below looked like it was dying. Huge sections of the surface glowed orange and red, where cities were burning. Smoke clouds covered entire continents. On the planet, like vultures circling a wounded animal, dozens of hegemony warships continued their bombardment. Their weapons fired constantly, sending beams of energy down to destroy whatever was left of the civilian population. "Sir, I'm reading approximately 40 enemy vessels," reported Lieutenant Yuna from her position at the sensor station. "Have the planet completely surrounded? I'm also detecting what looks like the remains of the Zephyrian defense fleet. Most of their ships appear to be destroyed or badly damaged." Seojin could see Admiral Minji's flagship limping through space, trailing debris and atmosphere from multiple hull breaches. The brave alien commander was still trying to fight, but her ship could barely move. The other surviving Zephyrian vessels were in similar condition. "Communications, send a message to Admiral Mingi," Seojin ordered. "Tell her the cavalry has arrived and to get her people to minimum safe distance." Behind Seojin's ship, 19 more human vessels dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation. These weren't the sleek, elegant ships that most galactic civilizations preferred. Human ships looked like they were built for war. They had thick armor plating, multiple weapon systems, and engines powerful enough to push them through any kind of combat situation. "Sir, the hegemony fleet is turning to face us," called out Tactical Officer Bianho. "They're forming up an standard battle formation. Looks like they're preparing for a conventional engagement." Siajin almost smiled, as the hegemony was about to learn that humans didn't fight conventional battles. "All ships, this is Phoenix Leader," he announced over the fleet communication channel. "Weapons are free. Rules of engagement are simple. Anything shooting at civilians is a valid target. Show them what Earth remembers about protecting the innocent." What happened next would have shocked any military academy professor in the galaxy. Instead of forming neat battle lines like civilized species were supposed to do, the human ships scattered in all directions. Some dove straight down toward the planet's surface. Others climbed high above the battle zone. A few actually accelerated directly toward the largest hegemony ships. The hegemony commanders had never seen anything like it. Their sensors couldn't track targets that were moving so unpredictably. Their weapons were designed to hit ships flying, in straight lines, not vessels that twisted and turned like angry wasps. "Phoenix 7, this is Phoenix Leader Siajin," called out to one of his pilots. "You have 3 enemy ships trying to flank you?" "Copy that, Leader." "Going to show them a little Earth hospitality?" Siajin watched through his tactical display as Phoenix 7 suddenly reversed course and flew directly at the 3 hegemony ships. At the last second, the human ship fired every weapon it had, then rammed straight into the middle enemy vessel. Both ships exploded in a ball of fire and debris. On her damaged flagship, Admiral Minji stared at her tactical screens in complete disbelief. The humans were fighting like nothing she had ever seen. They didn't retreat when they were outnumbered. They didn't try to preserve their ships when the battle got difficult. They fought like each battle was the last thing they would ever do. "Admiral," said her tactical officer, Haniel, in a whisper. "One of the human ships just lost its main engines. But instead of withdrawing, the crew is using their maneuvering thrusters to position themselves for a boarding action." As the damaged human ship latched onto a much larger hegemony cruiser, within minutes, she could see explosions flashing through the enemy ship's windows as human soldiers fought their way through the corridors inside. "How are they doing that?" Haniel asked. "Our intelligence reports say the hegemony uses energy weapons and plasma rifles. Human technology is supposed to be primitive compared to that. But the humans weren't losing these boarding actions. If anything, they seemed to be winning them easily. Every hegemony ship that tried to board a human vessel found themselves facing enemies that fought with an intensity that defied explanation. Commander Siojin's ship swooped low over the planet's surface, hunting for hegemony ground installations. When he found them, he didn't use precision strikes or surgical attacks. He used overwhelming firepower to eliminate anything that threatened civilians. After 4 hours of the most brutal space combat anyone had ever witnessed, the last hegemony ship either fled the system or was destroyed. The survivors limped away at maximum speed, broadcasting desperate retreat signals. Admiral Minji looked around her bridge at her stunned crew. They had just watched 20 human ships defeat a force twice their size, and they had done it in a way that broke every rule of civilized warfare. "What kind of beings are these humans?" Haniel whispered. Minji had no answer, but she was beginning to understand why the galaxy had been afraid of them. General Minho stood in the center of Earth's most important military command room, surrounded by screens that showed the entire galaxy. The room was built 3 kilometers underground, protected by layers of concrete and steel that could survive almost any attack. Right now, those screens were telling a story that was making alien governments across the galaxy very nervous. Each red dot on the display represented a hegemony fleet. Over the past 2 weeks, Minho had watched dozens of those red dots simply vanish. Every time human ships encountered the enemy, the hegemony forces either retreated or were completely destroyed. It was happening so fast that even Minho was surprised.
"Oh, General?"
"We have another priority message from the Galactic Council," said Lieutenant Yuna, walking up to him with a datapad in her hands. She looked tired. Everyone in the command center had been working around the clock since the war began. Minho took the pad and read the message quickly. His face showed no emotion, but inside he felt a familiar anger building. The same council that had locked humans away for 50 years was now telling them how to fight their wars. What do they want this time? He asked, handing the pad back. To Yuna, they're demanding that we stop all military operations immediately. They say our combat methods violate something called the laws of civilized warfare. Apparently, there are rules about how species are supposed to fight each other, and we're breaking most of them. Minho walked over to a large window that looked out over the command center's main floor. Below him, hundreds of military personnel worked at their stations, coordinating the war effort across dozens of star systems. These people had spent their entire careers preparing for a war they thought might never come. Send a message back to the council, he said, without turning around. Tell them that Earth does not recognize their authority over human military doctrine. Remind them that our ancestors spent millions of years fighting for survival on a planet that tried to kill them every single day. We learned to fight with rocks and sticks against predators that could tear us apart. We won't be lectured about warfare by species who surrender the moment things get difficult. The truth was that human military tactics had been developed over thousands of years of constant warfare. While other species had evolved on peaceful worlds where the biggest threat might be a natural disaster, humans had grown up on a planet full of deadly creatures, harsh weather, and limited resources. Every human strategy was based on one simple principle: survival at any cost. Captain Dongmin approached from the intelligence section, carrying a stack of battle reports. Sir, we're getting some interesting data from the front lines. Our boarding parties are consistently outperforming enemy forces, even though the hegemony has better technology. Minho turned to look at the reports. Explain. Well, sir, it seems that when our Marines board enemy ships, they're using kinetic weapons, basically advanced versions of guns that fire metal bullets. The hegemony uses energy weapons that are technically more powerful. But our people are still winning these close combat situations. This didn't surprise Minho at all. Human soldiers trained for combat in enclosed spaces, fighting room by room, corridor by corridor. They practiced combat scenarios where they might run out of ammunition, where their equipment might fail, where they might have to fight with whatever they could find. What about our casualty rates? He asked Captain Dongmin. Flipped through several pages before answering, That's the part that's really confusing the enemy, sir. When we take casualties, instead of retreating or asking for reinforcements, our remaining forces seem to fight even harder. There are reports of human pilots ramming their damaged fighters into enemy ships when they run out of missiles. Nodded. This was exactly what he had expected. Humans had learned long ago that sometimes the only way to win was to be willing to sacrifice everything. It wasn't that humans didn't value life. It was that they valued victory more than their own safety. Sir, said Lieutenant Yuna, reading from her communication console. We're getting reports from the hegemony's own communication channels. Their commanders are calling our tactics insane and suicidal. They're requesting permission to withdraw from several systems because they can't predict what our forces will do next. For the first time that day, Minho allowed himself a small smile. The galaxy was finally learning what the word Deathworld really meant. It wasn't just that Earth was a dangerous planet to live on. It was that living on such a dangerous planet had created a species that approached warfare completely differently from everyone else. Other species fought to win territory or resources. Humans fought to eliminate threats completely. Other species retreated when the odds were against them. Humans saw bad odds as just another challenge to overcome. The hegemony had spent decades conquering peaceful civilizations that followed the rules of civilized warfare. They were facing an enemy that had never heard of those rules and wouldn't follow them even. If they had, Supreme Commander Vexstar stood in the center of his massive command ship, looking down at reports that made his stomach turn with worry. The holographic displays around him showed numbers that shouldn't have been possible. In just 2 months of fighting against the humans, his forces had lost more ships than they had in the previous 6 years of conquest combined. His 4 arms trembled slightly as he picked up another datapad. The hegemony had built their entire military strategy around one simple concept: overwhelming force. They would arrive at a system with so many ships that resistance seemed pointless. Most species would take one look at the size of their fleet and surrender immediately. Those that tried to fight would be quickly crushed by superior numbers and advanced technology. But the humans were different. They didn't seem to care how many ships the hegemony brought to battle. They didn't calculate odds or worry about being outnumbered. They just fought with an intensity that Vexstar had never seen in 40 years of military campaigns. "Intelligence, Chief Krell," he called out, his voice echoing through the command center. "Approach my station immediately." Krell was a member of one of the first species the hegemony had conquered 20 years ago. It originally fought against them, but after his world was defeated, he had been forced to serve in their military. Over the years, he had become one of their most valuable intelligence officers because he understood how other species thought during wartime. "Yes," Supreme Commander Krell said, walking up to the command platform with his head bowed respectfully. Vexstar gestured at the casualty reports floating in the air around them. "Explain to me how a single species from one star system is destroying our war machine. We have fought dozens of different alien races. We have conquered entire civilizations. But these humans are different. How are they doing this?" Krell looked at the reports carefully before answering. He had been studying human combat footage for weeks, trying to understand their tactics. What he had discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. "Supreme Commander, the humans approach warfare completely differently from any other species we have encountered. When most civilizations fight, they do so with specific goals. They want to protect territory, or gain resources, or achieve political objectives. When the cost becomes too high, they retreat or surrender." Vexstar's mandibles clicked impatiently. Yes. This is normal military thinking. What makes the humans different?" "Sir, the humans seem to treat every battle as if the survival of their entire species depends on the outcome. They don't retreat when logic says they should. They don't surrender when they're clearly defeated. Most disturbing of all, they appear to consider death in battle, not as a failure, but as an acceptable way to achieve their goals." The Supreme Commander felt his blood temperature drop several degrees. In all his years of conquest, he had never encountered an enemy that wasn't afraid of death. Fear was the foundation of the hegemony's power. They won battles before they started by making enemies too scared to fight effectively. "Show me the combat footage from the Kepler system battle," Vexstar ordered. The holographic display changed to show recordings from last week's engagement. Hegemony ships had outnumbered the human fleet 3-1. By all military logic, the humans should have retreated or asked for terms of surrender. Instead, they had attacked immediately. Vexstar watched as human ships deliberately rammed into his cruisers when they ran out of ammunition. He saw human fighter pilots crashing their damaged spacecraft into hegemony command vessels. Most shocking of all, when human ships were boarded by hegemony soldiers, the crew would sometimes detonate their own vessels, rather than allow them to be captured. "This is madness," Vexstar whispered. "No rational species fights this way." "That may be the point, sir," Krell replied carefully. "Intelligence reports suggest that humans evolved on what they call a death world. A planet so dangerous that only the most aggressive and adaptable creatures could survive. For millions of years, they had to fight for every scrap of food, every safe place to sleep, every day of continued existence." Vexstar turned away from the displays and walked to the large window that looked out into space. In the distance, he could see several damaged hegemony ships limping back from there. "Latest encounter with human forces? What about our psychological warfare tactics?" he asked. "We have always been able to break enemy morale by demonstrating our superior firepower." "Sir, that's the most troubling part of all," Krell said. "Human morale seems to increase when they take casualties. Instead of becoming demoralized, the survivors appear to fight even harder. We intercepted communications from one human commander who told his crew that every fallen comrade was another reason to fight more fiercely." For the first time in his long military career, Supreme Commander Vexstar began to consider something. He had never thought possible. The hegemony might actually lose this war. Worse than that, the humans were inspiring other species to fight back with the same fearless determination. The galaxy was changing. Vexstar wasn't sure his empire could survive what was coming. Captain Dong-Yun was reviewing patrol reports. On the bridge of his destroyer, when the communication officer suddenly looked up with surprise on his face, they had been stationed in the Kepler system for 3 weeks now, protecting the colonies that had been liberated from hegemony control. It was supposed to be a quiet assignment, giving his crew time to rest between battles. "Sir, we're receiving an encrypted transmission on one of the old diplomatic channels," said Lieutenant Sionho. "The encryption pattern looks familiar, but I can't place it."
Ow.
Dong-Yun walked over to the communication station and looked at the data streaming across the screen. The encryption was definitely familiar. It was the same type used during the border wars 30 years ago, but that was impossible. All the species from those conflicts had been part of the coalition that demanded Earth's quarantine. "Run it through our old military decryption codes," he ordered, the ones from before. The isolation. After a few minutes, the message appeared on the main screen in clear text. Dong-Yun read it twice before he could believe what he was seeing. "Human fleet. This is Resistance Commander Zeph of the Altarian Liberation Front. We know our species. Have not spoken in many years, and we know there is bad blood between us from the old wars. But the hegemony threatens all free peoples in this galaxy. We offer you our complete navigation charts of hegemony space, intelligence reports on there, supply lines, and locations of their hidden bases. Our old grievances are secondary to current necessity." Dong-Yun stared at the message for a long moment. The Altarians had been one of humanity's fiercest enemies during the border wars. They had fought for 8 bloody years over mining rights in the Outer Rim territories. Thousands of humans and Altarians had died in battles that accomplished nothing except creating hatred between the two species. After the war ended, the Altarians had been one of the loudest voices calling for Earth to be quarantined. They had told the Galactic Council that humans were too violent, too unpredictable, too dangerous to be allowed to roam freely through civilized space. Now those same Altarians were asking for help. "Sir, should I respond?" asked Lieutenant Sionho. Dong-Yun thought about all the human soldiers who had died fighting Altarian forces. He thought about the colonies that had been attacked, the trade ships that had been destroyed, the families that had been torn apart by that long, pointless war. Then he thought about the hegemony and what they did to conquered peoples. He had seen the reports from the liberated world's entire populations enslaved, children separated from their parents, cities burned to the ground for no reason except to spread fear. "Open a channel," he said finally. "This is Captain Dong-Yun. Of the Earth Defense Force, Commander Zeph, we accept your offer of intelligence sharing. Transmit your data on Secure Channel 7. Our old wars are history. Today's enemy is the hegemony." Within hours, detailed star charts and intelligence reports were flowing into the human fleet's computers. The information was incredibly valuable. The Altarians had been watching hegemony movements for months, mapping their supply routes and identifying their weak points. But the Altarians weren't the only former enemies reaching out to humanity. Over the next few weeks, similar messages arrived from dozens of different species. The Centauri Trade Federation, who had fought humans over commercial disputes, the Vegan Republic, who had accused Earth of aggressive expansion, even the elegant Procenians, who had always considered humans to be primitive barbarians. All of them were now offering help against the hegemony engineer. Jisoo found herself working 16-hour shifts in the orbital shipyards above Kepler Prime, retrofitting alien vessels with human weapons and defense systems. Her current project was upgrading an Altarian cruiser with human-designed armor plating and missile systems. "This is weird," she said to her work partner, Engineer Ming-Yu, as they installed a new targeting computer. 6 months ago, if I had met an Altarian, we probably would have tried to kill each other. Now I'm helping them fight better." Ming-Yu looked up from the circuit panel he was working on. "My grandfather fought in the border wars. He always said the Altarians were tough fighters, just on the wrong side. But maybe now they're on the right side." Jisoo wiped sweat from her forehead and looked out through the shipyard's windows at the mixed fleet gathering in space. Human destroyers flew alongside Altarian cruisers and Centauri frigates. Former enemies were sharing tactical data and coordinating joint patrols. You know what's funny? She said. It took something as terrible as the hegemony to make everyone realize that our old fights were pretty stupid. We were arguing over trade routes and mining rights while these monsters were planning to enslave the entire galaxy. A message came through the shipyard's communication system announcing that another volunteer fleet had arrived. This time from the Rigel Collective, bringing medical supplies and technical specialists. Mingyu smiled as he watched the new ships take up positions in the growing Alliance fleet. My grandmother used to say that nothing brings people together like having a common enemy. Guess she was right. As Jisoo went back to work, she couldn't help but think that maybe this was how the galaxy was supposed to work. Different species putting aside their differences to protect each other from real threats. It had just taken 50 years and a galactic war to figure that out. Admiral Taeyeon stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Soul's Pride, looking out at the largest combined fleet in galactic history. Through the massive viewport, he could see hundreds of ships from dozens of different species, all working together for the first time in anyone's memory. Human destroyers flew in formation with Altarian cruisers. Centauri medical ships worked alongside Zephyrian supply vessels. Even the proud Procyonians had sent their elite fighter squadrons to join the fight. 6 months ago, this would have been impossible. The galaxy had been divided, with each species looking out only for themselves. Now facing the threat of the hegemony, old enemies had become allies. Former rivals were sharing their most advanced technology. Admiral Weir. Receiving the final status reports from all fleet commanders, said Commander Yeonjun, walking up with a datapad in his hands. Every ship is ready for the assault on the hegemony's industrial systems. Taeyeon took the pad and studied the numbers. They had assembled over 800 ships, the largest military force ever created by free species working together. But what made this fleet truly powerful wasn't just its size. It was the fact that every crew had been trained in human combat tactics. What's the latest intelligence on hegemony movements? Taeyeon asked. Sir, our deep space scouts report that they're pulling back from all their outer territories. They've abandoned at least 12 conquered systems in the past month, moving all their forces back to defend their core worlds. This was exactly what Taeyeon had hoped would happen. The hegemony's entire strategy had been based on constant expansion. They would conquer a system, strip it of resources, and use those resources to fund the conquest of the next system. But now they were retreating, which meant their war machine was running out of fuel. Sir, called out Intelligence Officer Boyang from her station across the bridge. We're intercepting communications from hegemony-controlled territories. It looks like their subject species are starting to rebel. There are uprisings on at least 6 different worlds. Taeyeon smiled grimly. This was the part of warfare that most military academies didn't teach psychology. The hegemony had controlled their conquered peoples through fear. They had convinced entire civilizations that resistance was hopeless. Their military was unbeatable. But now, those same peoples were seeing daily reports of hegemony fleets being destroyed by the human-led alliance. They were learning that their oppressors could be defeated, and that knowledge was spreading like wildfire through their territories. What about their supply lines? Taeyeon asked. Commander Yeonjun consulted. His datapad again. Falling apart, sir. They had organized their logistics around the assumption that they would keep conquering new systems. With their expansion stopped, they don't have enough raw materials to maintain their fleet at full strength. This was the genius of human military strategy, something that humans had learned from thousands of years of warfare on Earth. You didn't just defeat enemy armies, you destroyed their ability to fight. You cut off their supplies, turned their allies against them, and made it impossible for them to continue the war. Sir, we're also getting reports that several hegemony commanders have requested transfers to non-combat positions, added Boyang. Their officer corps is starting to lose confidence in their leadership. Taeyeon walked over to the tactical display that showed the current positions of all military forces in this part of the galaxy. 6 months ago, red markers representing hegemony fleets had been scattered across dozens of star systems, though they were all clustered around their home territory, pulled back into a defensive position. Do you know what the most important thing we've accomplished is? He said to his command staff. We haven't just won battles. We've taught the entire galaxy something new. What's that, sir? Asked Yeonjun. We've taught them how to fight back. For decades, species across the galaxy just accepted that the hegemony was too powerful to resist. They would surrender without even trying to defend themselves. But now they've seen that determination and courage can overcome superior numbers. And technology. Tayon activated the fleet communication system, connecting him to every ship in the massive armada. Captains and commanders from dozens of species appeared on screens around the bridge. All fleet commanders, this is Admiral Tayon. We are about to begin Phase 2 of our campaign against the hegemony. For 6 months, we have been on the defensive, protecting our worlds and liberating occupied territories. Now we take the fight. To them he paused, looking at the faces of beings who had once been enemies, but were now united in common cause. The hegemony made a critical mistake when they started this war. They thought humans were just another species to be conquered. They didn't understand that we aren't just fighters. We're teachers. We've taught you all something that they never expected: how to win. The fleet began moving toward hegemony space, hundreds of ships working in perfect coordination. The tide of the war had turned completely, and everyone in the galaxy knew it. Fleet Admiral Hyjin floated in the zero-gravity command center of her flagship, staring at the massive holographic display that showed the hegemony's ultimate stronghold. Nexus Prime hung in space ahead of them like a small moon, bristling with more weapons than some entire star systems possessed. The fortress was so large that it had its own artificial gravity, its own atmosphere, and enough supplies to survive a siege lasting decades. "Give me the technical analysis again," she said to her tactical officer. "Commander Kungwan." Kungwan activated his data pad and read from the intelligence reports.
Nexus Prime
Is approximately 800 kilometers in diameter. It has over 50,000 weapon platforms, energy shields that can deflect anything short of a supernova, and a garrison of roughly 2 million soldiers. The station has been attacked 17 times in the past 1,000 years. Every assault has failed. Hyjin studied the swirling defensive patterns around the fortress. Hundreds of smaller ships patrolled in carefully coordinated formations, ready to intercept any attacking force. The entire system was designed like a trap. Any enemy that got close enough to threaten the station would be surrounded and destroyed. "What would a conventional assault look like?" she asked. "We would need to break through their outer defense. Fleet first, which would cost us at least 30% of our ships," Kungwan replied. "Then we would have to penetrate their shield grid, which intelligence estimates would require another 20% casualties. Finally, we would need to conduct a direct assault on the station itself, fighting through their automated defenses and garrison troops. Total estimated casualties, 70% minimum." Hyjin turned away from the display and looked out through the command center's windows at her own fleet. Nearly 1,000 ships from dozens of different species floated in formation, waiting for her orders. These crews had followed human leadership for months, trusting in tactics that seemed crazy but somehow always worked. "You know what the problem is with conventional tactics?" she said to her staff. "Everyone expects them. The hegemony has spent 1,000 years preparing for enemies who follow the rules of civilized warfare." She activated the fleet communication system, connecting to every ship in the armada. "All commanders, this is Admiral Hyjin. We are about to attempt something that has never been done before. Nexus Prime has stood undefeated for a millennium. Today, we're going to show them what happens when Deathworlders get creative." What Hyjin proposed was so insane that several alien commanders asked her to repeat the orders twice. Instead of trying to fight through the fortress's defenses, they were going to ignore them completely. "All fighter squadrons and boarding pods, prepare for immediate launch," she commanded. "Target the station's surface directly. Don't worry about the defensive fleet. Just get to that station and find a way inside." At the same time, 3 of the fleet's heaviest cruisers began accelerating toward Nexus Prime at maximum speed. Crews had volunteered for what everyone knew was a suicide mission. They were going to ram the station's power grid, hoping to create enough chaos to give the boarding parties a chance. "Admiral, this is Captain Inwu of the Inchen," came a voice. "Over the communication system, my crew is ready. We'll make sure those power generators go dark." Hyjin watched as thousands of small craft launched from the fleet's carriers, swarming toward the massive fortress like angry insects. The hegemony's defensive fleet tried to intercept them, but there were too many targets moving in, too many directions. The three cruisers hit Nexus Prime's outer shell at nearly 10% of light speed. The explosions were visible from hundreds of thousands of kilometers away, sending shockwaves through the station's structure. Entire sections of the fortress went dark as power systems failed. Boarding parties away, called out flight controller. JON, all squadrons report successful penetration of the outer hull. What followed was 12 hours of the most brutal close-quarters combat in galactic history. Human Marines, trained for fighting in enclosed spaces, led mixed teams of alien soldiers room by room through the station's corridors. They used tactics that the hegemony garrison had never encountered, moving through ventilation systems, using explosives to create new passages, fighting with simple kinetic weapons that worked even when energy systems failed. Commander Kunwan coordinated the assault from the flagship. Watching as section after section of the fortress fell to the boarding parties, Admiral, the humans are doing something I've never seen before. When they encounter heavy resistance, instead of calling for reinforcements, they're sealing off those sections and going around them. They're not trying to clear every room, Hyjin explained. They're going straight for the command centers and critical systems. It's not about controlling territory, it's about breaking the enemy's ability to fight back. As the hours passed, more and more of Nexus Prime's systems went offline. The massive weapons that had protected it for centuries fell silent. The shield generators that had deflected countless attacks flickered and died. Finally, after 12 hours of continuous fighting, a message came through on the hegemony's emergency frequency. This is Fortress Commander Thekman. Nexus Prime surrenders. We request terms for the protection of our non-combatant personnel. Hyjin looked around at her exhausted command staff. They had just accomplished something that military experts had said was impossible. The unbreakable fortress of the hegemony had fallen, not to superior firepower or advanced technology, but to human stubbornness and creative thinking. Signal all ships, she said quietly. The fortress is ours. Begin rescue operations for survivors on both sides. The age of hegemony dominance was finally over. President Sunwoo walked slowly across the polished floor of the rebuilt Galactic Assembly Station, her footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. Around her, representatives from 47 different species sat in carefully arranged sections, each delegation wearing the traditional clothing of their homeworlds. The war against the hegemony had been over for 3 months. But the real challenge was just beginning. The old Galactic Assembly had been destroyed during the first week of the war, bombed into rubble by hegemony forces who wanted to eliminate any chance of organized resistance. With human engineering and funding from grateful species across the galaxy, it had been rebuilt bigger and stronger than before. Representatives of the Free Galaxy, Sunwoo began, her voice amplified by translation systems that converted her words into dozens of different languages simultaneously. We gather today not as conquerors and conquered, but as equals who have survived a terrible threat together. She paused and looked around the chamber at faces that represented the diversity of galactic civilization. Some were familiar. The Zephyrians who had first called for help, the Altarians who had become unexpected allies. Others belonged to species that humans had never encountered before the war. Beings who had emerged from hiding only after the hegemony's defeat. For too long this galaxy has been governed by fear, she continued. Fear of each other, fear of change, fear of those who were different. The old system of quarantines and restrictions, of treating entire species as threats to be contained, nearly led to our collective destruction.